Late one autumn night in the tiny town of Haverford, Amelia lay awake in her old creaky bed, listening to the gentle patter of rain on her bedroom window. She wasn't alone, not technically. Her roommate, Lily, lay sleeping in the bed across the room, her breathing steady, a soft sigh now and then. But something gnawed at Amelia, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She told herself it was just the usual late-night jitters. After all, Haverford was known for its ghost stories and strange occurrences, and their attic apartment, cheaply rented because no one else would live there, was supposedly haunted. But they'd been there for 3 months, and aside from a few creaks and odd noises, she hadn't seen anything to be afraid of. But tonight felt different. There was a thickness in the air, a kind of dread that she couldn't shake. She turned to look at Lily, half hoping her friend would be awake too, but her eyes were closed, peaceful. Amelia told herself to breathe, to calm down. Just as she started to settle, she heard a faint scratching sound coming from above her. Amelia held her breath. The sound was soft but unmistakable, the scrape of something hard against wood, moving with a deliberate rhythm. It couldn't be Lily. She was still in bed, her breathing slow and steady. Amelia's heart raced as the scratching grew louder, filling the quiet room. Her mind raced through possibilities. Mice, squirrels, but this was heavier, something else. Then came a knock, a distinct, calculated tapping from somewhere in the wall. Just 3 slow taps. Amelia sat up, peering around in the dim light of her room, which was only barely illuminated by the streetlight filtering through the thin curtains. She glanced over at Lily, but she was still sound asleep, somehow undisturbed. Gathering her courage, Amelia slid out of bed and padded quietly to the wall where she'd heard the sound. She pressed her ear against it, and the tapping returned. This time, even closer, like someone was knocking from the other side of the wall, directly in front of her. Cold dread filled her chest, and she pulled back, scanning the room for anything out of place. That's when she noticed something strange. The shadow. It loomed in the corner. Darker than anything else in the room, it was just a shape that seemed to writhe and breathe as if alive. She tried to tell herself it was just her mind playing tricks, just her fear turning shadows into monsters. But as she stared, the shadow took form. It looked almost human, tall and thin with elongated fingers that stretched and twisted. She blinked, hoping it would vanish, but it remained steady, unblinking, and it seemed to look right at her. Paralyzed, she watched as it moved, gliding across the wall, closer to her bed, closer to Lily. She wanted to scream, to wake her friend, to run, but her voice was trapped, her feet glued to the floor. The shadow figure reached the foot of Lily's bed and seemed to hover there, like it was studying her. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness. Amelia's legs finally unfroze, and she stumbled back, breathing hard, her gaze darting around, expecting the shadow to reappear. But the room was still. Everything seemed quiet, normal, festive, as if nothing had happened. She thought about waking Lily, but what would she say? That she'd seen a shadow? She knew her friend would brush it off as a nightmare. But as she looked closer at Lily, something didn't seem right. Her breathing had changed. It was shallow, quick, almost. The fear returned, twisting in her stomach. She leaned in, gently touching her friend's shoulder, hoping she'd wake up and laugh it all off. Tell her she was being silly. But Lily didn't stir. Amelia's hand moved to her friend's neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. Panic surged through her, and she shook Lily harder, her voice barely a whisper. "Lily, wake up, please." But her friend was cold to the touch, her skin pale, almost translucent under the dim light. Her mind raced, struggling to process what was happening. There had to be an explanation, a logical answer. People didn't just die like this, peacefully in their sleep. A terrible thought struck her, one she didn't want to believe. Maybe it wasn't natural. Maybe the shadow? No, that was impossible. She was being irrational. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone, ready to call for help. But before she could dial, the phone screen flickered to life on its own. Words appeared, scrawled in a ghostly script across the screen. 1 down, 1 to go. She dropped the phone, staring at it in horror, her heart pounding wildly. Her mind was screaming at her to run, to get out, to leave, but her legs wouldn't move. She glanced toward the door, desperate to escape, but the same shadow figure was there, blocking her way. It tilted its head almost mockingly, as if daring her to try. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take anymore, the figure dissolved, leaving behind only the faintest echo of a whisper in her mind, something she couldn't quite make out. Shaking, she stumbled back to her bed, curling up, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The next morning, Amelia was found in her bed, unresponsive, her face frozen in terror. The doctors couldn't explain it. No signs of trauma, no underlying health issues. Just gone. Rumors spread around Haverford about the haunted apartment, about how 2 young women had died there under mysterious circumstances. And for years, people would talk about the old building and its shadows, about the faint tapping that could sometimes be heard in the walls, and the chilling message that some tenants swore appeared on their phones in the middle of the night, one down, one to go. Emma loved her job as a night shift nurse, even if it meant long, lonely hours patrolling the quiet halls of an aging hospital. Most of her shifts were uneventful, save for the occasional patient who needed her at odd hours. But there was one room, room 209, that unsettled her. It wasn't on her regular rounds, thankfully. It was an unused room at the far end of the hallway, isolated and locked up since anyone could remember. The staff whispered about it, and every nurse seemed to have their own version of what happened in that room, but Emma usually brushed off their tales as superstition. Then, one rainy night, everything changed. It was around 3 a.m., the hospital's notorious dead hour, when the energy felt heavy and the silence pressed in. Emma was finishing up some paperwork when the faint, unmistakable buzz of the call button came to life. She looked at the panel and froze. It was room 209. She laughed to herself, convinced it was a malfunction, and ignored it, returning to her work. But the call button came alive again, blinking insistently, as though someone were pressing it repeatedly. Her heart began to pound as she stood up, grabbed her flashlight, and made her way toward the abandoned room, reassuring herself it was just an electrical glitch. As she approached room 209, she noticed a subtle chill in the air, a sharp drop in temperature that seemed to cling to her skin. She told herself it was just her nerves, but the sense of unease grew with each step. Finally, she reached the door. It was dark inside, just as she expected. No one had been in this room for years. But then she saw it, the faint outline of a figure, seated at the far end of the room, just barely visible in the glow of her flashlight. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It looked like a woman, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped, dressed in an old hospital gown. Her hair was long and unkempt, covering her face. Emma's instincts screamed at her to leave, to turn around and never look back. But she was rooted in place, unable to tear her gaze away from the eerie figure. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge her. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and Emma could feel her skin prickling with goosebumps. She took a shaky step closer, gripping her flashlight tightly. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She tried again, louder this time. The woman's head snapped up suddenly, and Emma stumbled back, her heart racing. The woman's face was ghastly pale, her eyes wide and hollow like deep, endless pits. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile, too wide, like someone had torn it open from ear to ear. And then she whispered in a raspy, broken voice, "I'm waiting for you." The words were barely a whisper, but they cut through Emma like ice. Before she could react, the figure lurched forward, moving with an unnatural, jerky speed. Emma dropped her flashlight, scrambling backward, her mind screaming for her to get out. She stumbled into the hallway, heart pounding, gasping for breath. In her panicked state, Emma ran straight to the nurse's station, almost collapsing into her colleague's arms. She tried to explain what she'd seen, but the words came out in disjointed fragments, a mix of fear and disbelief. Her colleague stared at her, eyes wide with a mix of pity and fear, and then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emma," she said quietly, "that room's been empty for years. You know that." Emma shook her head, still gasping, trying to make her friend understand. "I saw her! She was in there! She spoke to me!" The other nurse hesitated, then let out a slow, shuddering breath. "Emma, that room, there was a woman in there once. She passed away on a night just like this one. She used to call for the nurses at all hours, but no one ever answered. They say she's still waiting, calling for someone to help her." Emma's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. She'd just encountered the restless spirit of room 209, a ghost condemned to wait for help that would never come. For the rest of her shifts, she avoided that end of the hall. but the call button in room 209 would light up every now and then. No one dared to answer it, but Emma would sometimes hear a faint whisper from that empty room calling her name. Anna had always been a collector. Odd trinkets, antique knickknacks, even old tattered books with crumbling pages. If it was old and strange, she wanted it. Her favorite place to hunt for these treasures was a small, hidden thrift shop on the outskirts of town. The store was a dusty maze of discarded objects and forgotten memories, and the old man who ran it seemed to know every item by heart, like each was a long-lost friend. One rainy Saturday, Anna decided to stop by the shop again. As she browsed the shelves, her eyes landed on a peculiar item, a small, carved wooden box with delicate engravings, tucked away on a dusty shelf in the back. It looked ancient, and a strange, almost haunting energy seemed to radiate from it. Curious, she picked it up and studied the engravings. Small figures in a circle, hands joined, heads tilted downward. The shopkeeper saw her and immediately tensed. "That box, you don't want that," he said, his voice oddly strained. "What is it?" she asked, feeling an inexplicable urge to take it home. "It's best left alone," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "They say it's a vessel, a way for something to cross over. It's brought nothing but bad luck." But Anna was intrigued, and despite his warning, she insisted on buying it. She thought of it as another eerie treasure for her collection. He got a small piece of mystery she could unravel on her own. She carefully placed it on her living room shelf, admiring how it fit right in with her other unusual finds. That night, Anna found herself feeling restless. The house was quiet, but it was a heavy, oppressive kind of quiet, like the silence was hiding something. As she lay in bed, she could have sworn she heard faint whispers drifting through the stillness. She brushed it off, thinking she'd been spending too much time with her eerie collectibles. She turned over, pulled the blanket tighter, and willed herself to sleep. But as soon as her eyes closed, she felt a weight on her chest, something pressing down hard, making it difficult to breathe. Her eyes shot open, and she froze. A figure stood at the foot of her bed, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, or something like a man, tall and thin, with long, bony limbs and a face that was wrong, its features twisted and stretched, as if someone had tried to mold them with trembling hands. His eyes were dark, hollow pits, staring at her with an intense, unblinking gaze. Paralyzed, Anna tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, and she could hear a low, guttural whisper, like a voice from somewhere deep within the earth. "You opened the door," it rasped, its voice scraping against her mind like nails on glass. "Now you cannot close it." The figure reached out, one skeletal hand stretching toward her, its fingers impossibly long and thin, tipped with nails that seemed to glisten, dark and sharp. She could feel the air around her grow colder, sharper, as if it were turning to ice. Summoning every ounce of strength, she managed to throw herself out of bed, scrambling toward the light switch. She flicked it on, filling the room with a warm glow. The figure was gone. Heart racing, she turned around, frantically scanning the room, but there was no trace of the shadowy visitor. She tried to convince herself it had been a nightmare, that her imagination had run wild. But the next night, it happened again. As soon as she drifted off to sleep, the weight returned, pressing down, suffocating. This time, there were two figures standing side by side, their hollow eyes locked onto her, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. "We're waiting," they murmured in unison, their voices soft but chilling, filling her with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Each night, the figures returned, their numbers growing, until a small crowd gathered at the foot of her bed, watching her in silence, their hollow eyes unblinking. Each time they edged closer, reaching out, their fingers brushing against her skin, leaving her with a chilling, icy burn. Desperate, she returned to the thrift shop, clutching the wooden box, hoping the old man could help her undo whatever she'd unleashed. But when she arrived, the shop was empty, dark and abandoned. A closed sign hung on the door, covered in layers of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Panicking, she ran to the window, pressing her face against the glass, looking for any sign of the shopkeeper. But the inside was dark, the shelves empty, cobwebs hanging in the corners. It was as if the shop had never been there, as if she'd imagined it all. Defeated, she returned home, the box clutched tightly in her hands. That night, she placed it back on her shelf, hoping it would appease whatever was haunting her. But as she lay in bed, a final, terrible realization dawned on her. The whispers weren't coming from the box anymore. They were coming from inside her walls. Anna never slept again after that night. And the figures, they never left. Every night, they gathered at her bedside, their hollow eyes filled with silent hunger, waiting, watching. No one ever saw Anna again after that. When neighbors grew concerned and entered her home, they found it untouched, everything in place, nothing out of order, except for one thing. The wooden box sat on the shelf, lid open, completely empty. But inside the lid, in jagged, almost desperate scrawling, was a single message: "We're still waiting."